Hey folks, today we're going to be taking a look at two things: the open world Assassin's Creed games, the last three, and the Radeon RX 5600 XT, and how it performs in these titles at 1440p, a resolution which it's just not designed for. In all the AMD reference material, it clearly states that they think the RX 5600 XT is a supreme 1080p card. But I've been using it for the last few weeks as my primary card, and my primary gaming monitor is a 1440p display, and to be perfectly honest with you, it's held up really well. So with the release of the new Assassin's Creed Valhalla game, I thought it would be a neat idea to check how performance has changed over the last three titles, and how the 5600 XT stacks up in each. So the first title is obviously Assassin's Creed Origins. Now this game, it kinda departed from what we'd gotten used to with Assassin's Creed games, giving us a big open world to play in. Set in ancient Egypt, you encounter a lot of cities densely packed, and all in all, even though it's a few years old at this point, I think the game still looks really good. Now I'm running the benchmark here at native 1440p on the very high preset. And with all said and done, the RX 5600 XT performs really nicely. We're using a Ryzen 7 3700X here, overclocked to 4.5 GHz on all cores, and this combo, it gives us an average frame rate which is just above 60 FPS. 62 FPS while recording, and 64 FPS when the tests rerun without the recording software in place. Now the sequel to Origins was released a couple of years later, and it's Assassin's Creed Odyssey, set in ancient Greece, and this time we're treated to even more elaborate towns and cities, and it's a bit more densely packed than the environments we've seen in Origins. All in all, it proved to be a pretty stern test for PCs. A lot of people said that it was unoptimised, but really it just needed a little bit of tweaking to get the most optimum setup. But again, just like in Origins, the combo of the Ryzen 7 and the 5600 XT at 1440p on the very high preset, it returned results that were around about 60 FPS. 58 when recording, and just above 60 when there's no recording in play. Now it's worthwhile noting as well that these benchmark runs here, they sometimes show really low lows, but really in game you're hardly ever going to encounter frame rates that low. But it's worth noting nonetheless. Now Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and it ramps things up even further, even more densely packed environments, greater detail on the ground, and everything feels a bit more crowded, and there's a good bit more effects going on as well. Everything looks really nice. But while Assassin's Creed Odyssey, it was only about 5% harder to run on the very high preset compared with the predecessor Assassin's Creed Origins, when we run through Valhalla, again at 1440p on the very high preset, we're treated to about 35 FPS on average. Now that's a 42% decrease in performance when comparing the same settings game per game. Now it must be said that the very high preset for Valhalla, it does look like a big graphical step up compared to Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and dropping that detail down to the high preset, it nets us around 54 FPS on average, which is pretty good, and it's about 11% less than we've seen on the very high preset in Odyssey. While it's still probably looking better than Odyssey did. Now you might be tempted to think, oh well, I can just drop it down even further to the medium preset, and that will net you about 65 FPS on average, but I would advise highly against that, as you lose so much graphical fidelity, you lose screen space reflections, you lose a lot of the detail in the world, and on the medium preset or below, the game looks pretty terrible. But you don't need to fret. Just like the games before it, it turns out that if you do a few little tweaks here and there on the graphical settings, you can pull back some of that FPS that might have been lost. So all that I've done here to net a few extra FPS is drop the anti-aliasing down on the high preset from high to medium, and also the shadows again from high to medium. It's a really simple tweak, and it's one that will bring you back up to 60 FPS. Now compared to 54, that's about a 10% increase just for those two settings. Hardware Unboxed has done a really good guide on this, going through each of the settings and showing you the impact. So there is actually a few more settings you can tweak, dropping the anti-aliasing down further and still turning up some details, and you'll still be able to hit that magical 60 FPS mark. So stepping away from the benchmark for a bit and jumping into game, and you can kind of see that everything hovers around about that mid-50 mark, especially when engaged in combat or exploring some of the more densely packed or particle heavy environments. If you're like me and you use a FreeSync monitor, then any dips below 60 FPS, well, they just don't really matter, as FreeSync takes care of that. The odd dip here and there is perfectly fine. What I will say though about the RX 5600 XT is I've been so impressed by the card. I mean, it's only drawn around 100 to 110 watts of power. And if you look at the temperatures, I've been playing the game at this point for probably a good hour or so. And the GPU junction temperature is sitting in the mid-50s. Now I would like to note that the 5600 XT that I'm showing here, it has been overclocked by myself and it's also been undervolted. AMD has locked down the 5600 XT, and in the Radeon Performance Tuning tool, the max you can suggest the GPU to go to is 1820 MHz. Now, in game it very rarely hits that, hovering around the 1760 to 1780 kind of range. But at these clock speeds, you can undervolt the card quite nicely. Here it's sitting at around 950 millivolts, that's 0.95 volts, which obviously helps with the overall temperatures. The memory here can also be increased. Now I've already downloaded and flashed the BIOS on this to upgrade the standard speed from 12GB per second to 14GB per second memory. I've managed to push that a little bit further and ended up with 14.6GB per second. Now that gives a total bandwidth of over 350GB per second. And even though the card is on a 192-bit memory bus, the fact that it's GDDR6 at those speeds still means you're getting more bandwidth than you would have been with a GTX 1080 back in the day. Jumping into the high Cs kind of sees a bit more variability in the frame rate. We can see anywhere from the mid-40s up to the mid-70s depending on what's going on. But the cinematic view that you can toggle on when you're just autopiloting to your destination, it gives you a good idea of the types of frame rates you could encounter through the game. Again, I just want to point out how stable those temperatures are for this Gigabyte RX 5600 XT. It's definitely a card we're going to look at in the future in a bit more depth. And also the low power draw. 1440p, high settings on a AAA title, and just over 100 watts of power. It's pretty good going for a card that's just not designed for that resolution. Now of course, with the 5600 XT, if you're going to use it like it was intended at 1080p, you can start to max out the details even further and you're going to have no problems whatsoever hitting a rock stable 60 FPS. But it is nice to know that with a few tweaks here and there, higher resolutions simply are not a problem. Now I would like to address the fact that Radeon and AMD have locked the GPU clock speeds down, artificially I might add. I mean, at under 1 volt, it's not unreasonable to suggest that we could probably be hitting 2 GHz on this card if it was simply unlocked. But then that would pose a problem since the GPU configuration itself is identical to the RX 5700, just with the cut down memory bus and the lower allocation of VRAM. But if it was unlocked, well, I'd say that would probably nudge this card into a true 1440p card, at the low end at least. But that's been a quick look over the Assassin's Creed trilogy, the last 3 games, and how it runs on this RX 5600 XT. It's a card that, well, just not a lot of people, they don't really care about it. It's not a headline grabbing card, while at the same time, it's not a card that's cheap enough to be on the radar for all the bargain hunters. It kind of sits in no man's land, a bit like the RTX 2060. But I guess I just wanted to make this video to show that gaming at ultra settings, it's not everything. And even a humble mid-range GPU is going to see you perfectly fine over the next few years, even if you decide to dabble with higher resolution monitors. But hey, I'm going to leave it there for today, folks. Let me know what your thoughts are on the latest Assassin's Creed game and also the RX 5600 XT. It's a card that came out and then disappeared off everybody's radar pretty quickly, and I would love to know what you think of it. All I'll say though is just take care, and I'll see you all in the comment section down below and in the next video.